الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Talkhis Nukhbatul Fikr, as we had mentioned that the asl of this book is by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, that in his famous work Nukhbatul Fikr. But of the ulama wal mashaykh that have given this book many great attention, and amongst those who have explained the book many, and also those who have even made a muqtasar, try to summarize the book so as to easy for the beginner to understand this book. So we have started, or we have been discussing this book, Nukhbatul Fikr, or Talkhis Nukhbatul Fikr, and today inshallah ta'ala we'll be discussing, as the author mentioned, Qism Thani. So the author rahimahullah ta'ala have mentioned of this book, Qism Thani, which this particular qism that we'll be discussing, as he mentioned, Mardud, a hadith that are said to be Mardud. So we have covered in Qism al-Awwal, matter that relates to Hadith al-Maqbul. Now we'll be discussing matter that relates to Qism Thani, the second and the second matters that relates to matters of Hadith al-Mardud. So you mentioned that al-Mardud هو ما ترجى خطأ المخبر به ويشمل ضعيف جدا موضوع أسباب رد الخبر سقط وتان في الراوي. Then he mentioned والسبب الأول يعني السقط ينقسم السقط باعتبار موضعه والسقط باعتبار وضوحه. Then also he mentioned والسقط then he went into discussing concerning matter regarding as-saqt. So inshallah ta'ala now we'll be discussing this area regarding Hadith al-Mardud. So he mentioned al-Mardud, which he mentioned Hadith as the ulama have categorized Hadith that they are in general of two categories. Hadith Maqbul, those that are said to be acceptable, and of that Hadith as-Sahih wal Hadith al-Hasan fall in that category. And the next category is Hadith al-Mawdu, Hadith al-Mardud, Hadith al-Mardud. And in that category, everything that falls outside Hadith al-Maqbul. So everything opposite Hadith Maqbul, acceptable, then they fall into Mardud. Which is, and that also, as we'll discuss regarding what is mentioned. He mentioned with this that it includes Hadith Daeef Jiddan, Mawdu. So those are the Hadith regarding that Hadith Mardud. It will include those Hadith that are said to be Daeef Jiddan, very weak Hadith, and also Mawdu, which are Hadith that are said to be fabricated. So we'll be now entering into this discussion, giving some more clarity on these matters. And also these are very important matters that are covered in the books of Hadith. So starting discussing, as he stated regarding Hadith al-Mardud, as he referred to it, and the ulama refer to Hadith al-Daeef. So they mentioned Hadith al-Daeef, but he mentioned a more general term, Mardud, where it includes different levels of Hadith that are weak or rejected. So the first of those are Hadith al-Daeef. The first of those are Hadith al-Daeef, that falls into this section of Hadith al-Mardud. So he mentioned Hadith al-Daeef. So Hadith al-Daeef, that the first of that discussion is to explain as to what is Hadith al-Daeef. And by this, we'll first start by explaining what is Daeef meant in linguistically, what is meant in the language. So Daeef lugatan istilah, according to the ulama, according to the language, it means did al-qawi was sahih. So Daeef, it means that something which is opposite that which is said to be qawi, or that which is said to be sahih, that is the opposite. And Daeef also, it means something which is saqam or saqim. So Daeef, saqim, something which is somewhat frail, that is the meaning of Daeef. So I said it's khilaf, qawi, was saha. So that's concerning the linguistic meaning of Daeef. So a person said the person of not Daeef al-aql, that a person is not functioning to his best capacity mentally. So regarding his understanding and the likes. So as for a Daeef, second in a matter, the second is a Hadith istilahan. So istilahan in the ulama al-hadith. So Daeef, what is meant by Hadith Daeef according to the ulama of hadith. So they mentioned that hadith, that they are giving it various meanings. So you have hadith, somewhat of various meaning that have been given to it. As for what is mentioned regarding concerning hadith or daif, that of the ulama mentioned that daif of hadith, hadith daif, كل حديث لم تجتمع فيه صفات القبول. كل, so every hadith, لم تجتمع, that did not include فيه صفات القبول. So any hadith that does not consist and includes all the sifat that are said to be maqbul, then that is said to be daif. So if the hadith does not fulfill the criteria of hadith al-maqbul, it is said to be daif. So that's of the way the ulama of some of the ulama have explained as to what is hadith daif. Another way that they've expressed hadith daif, that they have mentioned regarding that hadith ad-daif, huwa ما فقد شرط أو أكثر من شروط حديث المقبول. So another way of expressing or explaining as to what is hadith ad-daif, that of the ulama who mentioned ما فقد شرط أو أكثر من شروط حديث المقبول. So any hadith that forfeits one or more of the condition of hadith maqbul, then it's said to be hadith daif. So meaning that any hadith that does not fulfill the criteria of hadith or miss any of the criteria or more of the hadith al-maqbul, hadith accepted, then it is mardud. And also the ulama mentioned that, so that's concerning hadith that is said to be daif. So you have different wording that have been given regarding hadith that is said to be daif. So the ulama, so that's concerning that hadith of those who mention ما لم تجتمع فيه صفات حديث الصحيح ولا صفات حديث الحسن, which is somewhat more lengthy regarding the definition. Where I mentioned that hadith as-sahih, that which did not fulfill the criteria of hadith as-sahih, nor the criteria of hadith al-hasan. That's somewhat lengthy. So the ulama somewhat tried to summarize that by mention that it stated كل حديث لم تجتمع فيه صفات الحديث المقبول. Every hadith that does not fulfill the criteria or miss the criteria of hadith maqbul. So meaning by this definition that hadith that forfeits any of the criteria that is laid down for hadith al-maqbul. And hadith al-maqbul, it has 5 criteria. We have mentioned ittisal sanad. So if this ittisal sanad is not present, the hadith becomes mardud. It's daif, rejected. Or dabt al-rawat, or the narrators are not to a level of acceptable dabt, memory of the hadith, then that forfeit a criteria. Or adalatul rawat, or the narrators, they are not of a level of adala, the level of credibility, their standing is not to a acceptable degree, so they have forfeit a condition, of adala. Or adam shudud, the hadith that have matters in it that are said to be shudud, that are odd or contradicts other narration, then it is weak. Or the hadith is said to be adam al-illa, that have hidden defects that have been detected, then that will grade the hadith as being mardud. So these are the criteria regarding hadith that are in place. So each of those criteria have to be looked at, of the 5 criteria of sahih or hadith al-maqbul. If any of them are missed or not fulfilled, then hadith will be said to be mardud. Hadith is said to be daif. So by this, another of those masahil that the ulama, so that's concerning, and as the author mentioned regarding concerning that with hadith that are said to be hadith ad-daif, that as he mentioned, I liked that they are different maratib. As he mentioned, yashmil hadith al-mardud, hadith al-daif, daif jiddan, wal mawdu. So, and others that fall in between. So you find that so hadith ad-daif, mardud, they are different degrees. Tafawut, maratib. So they have different degrees of weakness. Some are said to be daif, some said to be Daeef jiddan, and some said to the worst degree, which is mawdu'. The hadith is said to be referred to as fabricated mawdu'. So that also to be considered that hadith are not on Daeef all on the same level or the same par. They vary in their level of weakness. So with that you find that hadith that is said to be Daeef, that they fall into the category of that Daeef, which is daf khafif. It has a weakness, or khafif daf. That is a slight weakness in the hadith. So it is weak, but not severely weak. So those hadith that may be slightness in weakness, that you might have a narrator who said to be sayyul ifs. Nam, so a narrator that so that is daf yasir. So you might find those categories of hadith are said to be daf yasir. Then also you find those hadith that are said to be shadid al-daf, daif jiddan, shadid al-daf. So the first category I mentioned, daf yasir or khafif al-daf, that's the first level. Also you have a level of hadith we said to be daif jiddan, as the author here he mentions, where those hadith that their level of weakness is very strong, shadid al-daf, where those hadith that they are somewhat completely dismissed. They cannot use to strengthen anything, nor anything can use to support it. So it cannot support any other hadith to give it strength, nor can it be supported by others to give it strength, to raise it to an acceptable level, because the weakness is shadid, daf shadid, or daif jiddan. So hadith is said to be daif jiddan, then it is very, very weak. It is very weak and dismissed. Then the worst of those category that some mentioned, that like I said to be matruk, also the level of hadith of being weak, severely weak, matruk. And then the worst of those hadith is said to be mawdu'. Is said to be mawdu', and each of those will be covered separately. So each will be covered. So you have find hadith regarding being daif, mardud. They have different degrees, and also they fall into different categories. So different degrees. Again, another way of saying it: hadith daif munjabar. The hadith is weak, but the weakness is slight. So it could be munjabar. It could be supported by other hadith and give it strength, or it could be hadith daf al-shadid غير munjabar, where it is very weak, where it cannot be supported or aided by other hadith. And also you have mawdu', which is also a completely different category of hadith, that is completely fabricated, something which has been fabricated upon the Prophet ﷺ. So that's concerning hadith. And also regarding that al-daf of different levels, daif jiddan of different levels. So those are things to discuss. Then next of those things that are discussed regarding hadith, so of those hadith that are said to be of the matter regarding hadith to daif or mawdu', aqsam hadith al-mawdu'a mardud. Hadith al-mardud, they fall into different categories. Hadith al-mardud fall into different categories. So of those categories they mentioned that there are many. So if the ulama discuss concerning hadith are said to be weak, that they have, the ulama have given weakness different labels, or different names have been given, or terminology given to that level of weakness, or the type of weakness. So they mentioned regarding that at times, the ulama, that the categories of hadith ad-daif, some mention it falls into over 40 something different categories. Hadith al-mardud fall into over 40 something levels. Others who have mentioned that they go to over 63. Hadith al-daif or hadith al-mardud, there are over 63 types. And those who mention it's above 100. That hadith al-daif, it exceed over 100 different types of hadith. So you have that discussion between the ulama, and they mentioned that this difference regarding the different categories of hadith al-daif, whether it is over 40, over 60, over 100, that sometimes those things are a nazari. And sometimes they can place a name to certain hadith, and sometimes there's no specific name given to that type of weakness. Take into account that hadith that are said to be daif, that also the weakness can occur, that I mentioned in the definition that, I said in some definition, ما فقد شرط أو أكثر من الشروط. If it forfeits one condition or many conditions. So some hadith, within the weakness of the hadith, it may forfeit not just one condition, but multiple conditions. It has multiple forfeited many of the condition for the criteria for acceptance. So sometimes that occur. Sometimes this occur. So as we mentioned, that the ulama, they disagree or have a discussion. Some of this is more nazari, more things that is what they have put forward or something in mind. But as for practicality, then it's different. But hadith al-mardud, it falls into many categories. Some of those categories have been given specific names, and some no specific names. Some have been given particular names. So we're more centered around those ones that have been established by way of name regarding that weakness. Also regarding a weakness in the hadith, as they also mentioned, that asbab. So asbab, hadith al-mardud. What are some of the reasons, asbab, why hadith is said to be mardud, is said to be rejected? So as we mentioned, that the asbab, it falls into different. As we mentioned, you have the general rule regarding that is to see as to what are the criteria that have been put in place for that if the hadith fulfill these criteria is said to be maqbool. I mentioned and is established there are 5. Ittisal al-sanad, dabt al-riwat, so the connection of the isnad, the dabt of the rawat, the narrators of good memory. Third, adalatul rawat, the narrators are said to be trustworthy, credible, outstanding individuals, reliable individuals. Fourth, adam ash-shudud, that there's no contradiction or anything which is odd about the hadith. And also fifth, that adam al-illa, there's no hidden defects in the hadith. So these are the criteria for authenticity, for hadith to be deemed maqbool. So if any of these, so in every hadith, they have to be measured according to those 5 criteria. Every hadith have to be measured according to those criteria to see whether those criteria are present or absent. So with this, that so based upon this, that asbab ad-daf could be, they mentioned that in general, that it could fall into 2 reasons. One, they mention saqt fil isnad or tan for rawat. So of the reason, the general reasons of hadith being said to be daif, mardud, that either by way of saqt fil isnad, that there's a saqt, there's a breakage in the isnad. Or second, tan for rawi, or tan for wari, that there's an attack upon the narrator. There's a severe criticism upon the narrator. So those are the general of the reasons the hadith is said to be daif, that in the isnad is not complete, or there's an attack, something that is critical about a narrator regarding him or his narration, regarding him as the person, the narrator, or his narrations, what he have said. So that's concerning hadith that is said to be the general asbab, general asbab, why hadith is said to be mardud. So you might find that a narrator is criticized, or as we mentioned, saqt fil isnad. There's a saqt fil isnad. So daf sabab as-saqt fil isnad, that what will be included in that discussion, that is looking at the isnad and to see as to where that saqt, that person that is missing, that breakage occur in the isnad. So depending on where the breakage occur in the isnad, then the hadith will be given a particular name. So it occurs either in the hadith, the isnad, with a different isnad, that either if it occurs either at the beginning of the hadith, or the end of the hadith, or in the middle of the hadith, within the hadith. So either at one end, the beginning, or the start, or the ending of the hadith, or within the middle. So in that matter, they discuss concern that's not so if it occurs as well, and each of those are discussed separately. So each will be discussed separately and the ahkam that relates to it. So and in general, that the breakage may occur in the isnad from where the collector, the one who is compiling that book of hadith. So the compiler, it could be, and the compilers, we have many compilers of hadith. So it could be by way from the side of the closer to the compiler, the collector of the hadith, the one making that collection, gathering of those hadiths. If a breakage occur between him and the person next in line to him, then that's from that angle. And that is given a particular name which is called in general mu'allaq, and to be discussed further. So when you hear the word mu'allaq, we get the person understand that the breakage is occurring from the side of from the direction of the compiler. On the other end, if it is by way of someone narrated upon the Prophet ﷺ, but the Sahabi and others may be missing, is referred to as mursal. So someone narrated upon the Prophet ﷺ, but there should be others in between, then that is called mursal. Then, and there's the two ends, then within the isnad of the hadith, if it's called, you have munqata', mu'dal, that are of those terms that are used, and also at times mudallis. So these are breakage that occur inside the isnad. So I need mu'allaq, munqata', mu'dal, mursal al-khafi, and all these terms indicate that there's a possibly that the breakage that occurred within the isnad. As for the next side regarding concerning that asbab ad-da'f al-hadith could be by way of tan firrawi. Tan firrawi. We find that the person that goes back now to the narrator himself. So it goes back to the narrator himself regarding concerning his level. That goes back into two matter regarding his adala and his dabt. So it goes back to that narrator, the person regarding him is adala, and second is dabt, is ability to memorize, to report that hadith correctly, is memory of that hadith, or it goes back to him regarding his adala, his credibility is not intact. So those are those reasons. So at times it goes back to the person's, the narrator is adala. That will be discussed in the bab of Hajar wa ta'adil, going back to the narrator and critiquing the narrator as a person, his level of adala, his level of credibility and standing. So that is min bab Hajar, from the area of jar wa ta'adil, grading and critiquing of the narrator himself. Then also the second thing to critique about the narrator is level of dabt, how precise the narrator is in his narration. So these are the things that will be covered regarding that. These are the reasons of hadith being said to be daif. So the narrator in his dabt of the hadith, that he may make error, and no one is immune from error. So at times that a person also that a narrator is said to be thiqah, hafiz, then he also can make error. So overall, that hadith is said to be daif based upon looking the reasons, primary reasons, saqt fil isnad or tan fil rawi. Saqt fil isnad, that there's a breakage in the isnad, and second, that there's a tan, there's an attack upon A criticism of the narrator regarding one is adala, is credibility and standing, and second is dabt, is memory of the hadith. On this matter, regarding this topic, there are times you'll find that the ulama may disagree on certain hadith. So even in hadith al-Daeef, you might find that the grading of the ulama, they may vary regarding on this matter, that a particular hadith, some may hold a hadith to be Daeef, while others may not, especially in the area concerning that regarding ad-daf yasir. So we do at times may have a difference between the ulama regarding their grading of hadith being Daeef. Some may say it is the weak, where others may say otherwise. So this sometimes occur. Our next method are covered on this particular topic. They discuss regarding hukum, riwayat, hadith, ad-daif. What's the hukum in narrating hadith that is said to be daif? What's the hukum narrating hadith that is said to be daif, mardud? In this case, so we know hadith regarding mardud fall into different categories, but a general thing, as general of reporting hadith that is said to be daif. So report of hadith, daif. Riwayah, so we're talking about riwayat, hadith, daif. Hukum, riwayat, hadith, daif. Narrating hadith that is daif. In a sense of either person narrating of the hadith, either way, something is written in a book, someone have written an hadith in a book, so someone wrote a hadith in a book. What's the ruling on this? Or the person, by way of the person have uttered, say a hadith, talaffaz bil hadith daif, is narrating hadith, yarwi hadith bilaf, with wordings. What's the ruling regarding this? On this matter, that the ulama have mentioned regarding that they call riwayat of hadith, that either that narration of the hadith will be done with an isnad. So the hadith will be narrated with an isnad. That you'll find in the books of the ulama. They said those books, the ulama of the classical ulama of the past, that in the first generation of Islam, of Islam, and the scholar, that the ulama, when they wrote book, then they wrote book with isnad. So books of, and in particular books of hadith, as we're discussing hadith, that they will write, when they wrote their books, that it will be recorded, they wrote those books with the hadith with isnad, from the author to the Prophet ﷺ or to whoever else. So with this matter, that a person, Abu Dawood, for example, Abu Dawood, rahimahullah ta'ala, Bukhari, that they write their books with an isnad. So that's a form of riwayah, hadith, maktuba, of writing hadith, maktuba. But we said in a case the hadith is daif. The ulama have mentioned that the fact that the person have recorded it, then he's free, that is of no blame. So if something which is recorded with isnad, then they mention that it is allowed to be done. The person, by way of mentioning isnad, then it is something, whether it is uttered or it has been written, then no blame, then there's no blame upon, then this is allowed to be done. And the ulama in their books have done this. So you find that the ulama in the early years of Islam, when they were recording, compiling of their book, they did this. So outside kutub, outside as-sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim, that most of the other books of hadith, that, and especially those that did not stipulate a criteria of authenticity, that they do include hadith which is daif, even hadith which is mawdu'. So they mention that the fact that the author have mentioned an isnad, then he has fulfilled his obligation. And it's upon you to investigate what is there. Because he have given you an isnad. فَمَنْ أَسْنَدَ, as they mentioned, فَمَنْ أَسْنَدَ, the one who have given an isnad, فَقَدْ بَرِيَ, or أَحَالَ, that the one who have given isnad, then he has done his he has done his duty. And it's upon you to verify it. Upon us, the others, upon you to verify, because he has given you isnad. So something that for you to check and to verify and to investigate. So he has done his part and hasn't deceived you by giving you the isnad for you now to verify. So yes, the ulama mentioned that it is allowed, and that we find that in the tradition of the ulama that they have in most of the books of hadith that they have mentioned hadith daif, especially those that didn't stipulate authenticity. So I find that in Kutub as-Sitta, the 6 books of hadith outside Bukhari and Muslim, like in the books of Sunan Abu Dawud, Jami' al-Tirmidhi, Sunan al-Nasa'i, wa Sunan Ibn Majah, that they do have hadith which are weak. But I mentioned with isnad. And sometimes this was intended, that they intended to put a hadith with daif. So the persons are aware of this. But they also do so by putting an isnad. So this is show the permissibility of this. The second of riwayat hadith ad-daif, by way of, and I mentioned in books without an isnad, bidun isnad. So the person who have mentioned hadith which is daif, but did not mention their isnad. Is this allowed? So for example, a person might go to of the second of the more some of the books, latter day scholars book, such as the book of Riyadh al-Salihin, Arba'in an-Nawawiyah, and books of that nature, Subul al-Bulugh al-Maram. So books of that nature that have no isnad, can a person in general mention hadith daif in these books? Now the ulama mentioned that of those who mentioned that it is allowed if the person clarified that the hadith, give the ruling on the hadith. If it is daif, then the person, he make this be known by stating this. Mention the hadith and the end, hadith daif. So you find that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala in his book Bulugh al-Maram, that at times he will mention the hukm on the hadith. So it's without isnad, but at times he will mention some of the hadith regarding clarifying the hadith is daif, so you pass that judgment on the hadith. So that of the ulama who take the view that one should, if mention hadith daif, then one should state the ruling, clarify it is daif by stating hadith daif. Or laysa sahih, laysa thabit, but let the person know it is not authentic. Of the ulama who mentions, the second opinion is that the person is allowed to mention hadith daif without an isnad, but he should narrate it in a way which is tamrid. So in the way of how he narrate the hadith, he should say, when he mentioned about not to say qala Rasulullah, so not to narrate the hadith by way of jazm, that can sound to show that the person that not word of jazm, that show that of word that but more so word of tamrid. So jazm indicate the hadith it is sahih, well jazm so indicate the sahih, what tamrid that it is weak. So the person saying qila, yuqal, ruwiya. So in these ways they said it is allowed, because those are sigat tamrid, indicating hadith of some weakness. The person is unclear and not using word that seems more definite. Qala Rasulullah alayhi salam. So that's concerning the views of the ulama on this matter regarding narration of hadith. Is it allowed or not? So we mentioned that with isnad and without isnad. With this, inshallah ta'ala, we'll come to an end regarding this discussion, this part of the lesson regarding, or this session regarding hadith al-mardud, more so hadith al-daif. And inshallah ta'ala in next session we'll continue discussing Hadith al-Mardud, regarding Hadith Daeef, and others of those masahil that relates to Hadith Daeef. Of those, Hadith Fadal al-Amal, and the books of Hadith, and a few points regarding Hadith Daeef. So that inshallah, so today we have covered regarding the Mustalah, Hadith al-Mardud, that it falls into different categories of those that are Daeef Jiddan, to the extent of Mawdu'. We discussed what is said to be Hadith Daeef, what is classed as Hadith Daeef linguistically, and also according to the ulama of Hadith, as how they define Hadith Daeef, and also what we have mentioned regarding that they have maratib. Hadith Daeef are not different levels, also different aqsam, also different asbab, different ways, reason why they are said to be weak, and also we have discussed regarding hukum riwayat al-hadith ad-daif. So that inshallah will end the session and continue this discussion in the coming lesson or session. With this inshallah will end. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخرة ورحمة الأمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.